In the crisp morning air of the military academy, 205 young cadets stood at attention, their polished boots gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the ceremonial hall. They had gathered to witness what their commanding officers believed would be a lesson in accountability and military justice. What they didn't know was that they were about to watch the most decorated covert operative in their nation's recent history have her ranks stripped away in front of them. The woman standing before them looked ordinary enough. Medium height, steady gaze, shoulders squared with military precision. But behind those calm eyes lay secrets that could topple governments and memories of missions that officially never happened. She had spent 15 years in the shadows, completing operations so classified that even her own family believed she worked a desk job in military logistics. Today, however, Colonel Sarah Chun was being publicly humiliated for a crime she didn't commit by officers who had no idea that just 3 months earlier she had single-handedly prevented an international incident that could have started a war. As the Academy's commandant reached for the insignia on her uniform, Sarah made a decision that would change everything, not just for her, but for every person in that room. This is the story of how the military's most guarded secret became its greatest scandal, and how one woman's fall from grace became her most important mission yet. Sarah Chun had always been different from other military officers, though no one could quite put their finger on why. She moved through the halls of Westfield Military Academy with a quiet confidence that seemed almost supernatural. Other instructors noticed how she could predict cadet behavior with uncanny accuracy, how she seemed to know things about military strategy that weren't taught in any textbook, and how she carried herself like someone who had seen far more than her official service record suggested. What they didn't know was that Colonel Chun had spent the last 15 years living multiple lives. To her colleagues at the academy, she was simply an experienced infantry officer who had served several tours overseas. To her family, she was a logistics coordinator who rarely talked about her work. To the handful of people with the highest security clearances in the government, she was Ghost 7, one of the most effective covert operatives in the history of modern warfare. The Academy had become her cover assignment 6 months ago, a way to maintain her military position while she recovered from her last mission. The operation in Belarus had gone sideways in ways that still gave her nightmares, and her handlers had decided she needed time to decompress before her next deployment. Teaching military history and combat tactics to eager young cadets seemed like the perfect low-stress assignment. Sarah found herself genuinely enjoying the work. The cadets were bright, motivated, and reminded her of herself at that age, hungry to serve their country and make a difference in the world. She particularly enjoyed the strategic planning classes, where she could share hard-won wisdom about real-world combat situations without revealing their classified nature. The cadets would lean forward in their seats as she described hypothetical scenarios that were actually based on her own experiences in places like Afghanistan, Syria, and various locations she couldn't name even in her own thoughts. Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez was one of her best students. The young man had an intuitive grasp of battlefield tactics that impressed even Sarah. During one exercise, he had proposed a solution to a hostage rescue scenario that was remarkably similar to an approach Sarah had actually used in Somalia 2 years earlier. When she commended his creative thinking, Marcus had flushed with pride and worked even harder in subsequent classes. Cadet Angela Morrison was another standout. The 20-year-old from rural Montana had overcome significant obstacles to earn her place at the academy. She came from a family that had never fully supported her military ambitions, but her determination and natural leadership abilities made her a favorite among both instructors and fellow cadets. Sarah saw something of herself in Angela's fierce independence and quiet strength. The Academy's daily routine provided Sarah with a structure she hadn't realized she missed. Wake at 0500, physical training at 0530, breakfast at 0700, classes from 0800 to 1600, more training until 1800, dinner, and lights out at 2200. It was so different from the unpredictable chaos of covert operations, where she might go days without sleep or spend weeks maintaining a false identity in hostile territory. For the first time in years, Sarah allowed herself to imagine a different kind of life. Maybe she could request permanent assignment to the academy. Maybe she could eventually retire from active duty and continue teaching. Maybe she could finally use her real name in all aspects of her life instead of juggling multiple identities and cover stories. She had been particularly careful to maintain her cover at the academy. Her service record showed deployments to standard military bases in Iraq and Afghanistan with appropriate gaps that could be explained by classified, but routine intelligence work. Her colleagues knew her as a competent, if somewhat reserved, officer who had earned her rank through steady service and excellent performance evaluations. The irony was that her actual service record was far more impressive than her cover story suggested. In addition to her official military decorations, Sarah had earned commendations that would never appear on any public record. She had been awarded the Intelligence Star 3 times for operations that saved countless lives. She had prevented terrorist attacks in major American cities, disrupted international arms dealing networks, and gathered intelligence that had shaped foreign policy decisions at the highest levels of government. But she had also paid a personal price for her service. The constant deception required for covert work had made genuine relationships nearly impossible. She had been engaged twice, but both relationships had ended when the strain of her secret life became too much to bear. Her family loved her, but barely knew her, believing she was far less accomplished than she actually was. The weight of carrying so many secrets had become exhausting. Sarah found herself envying her cadets for the straightforward nature of their military service. They would serve their country openly, earn recognition for their achievements, and build relationships based on honesty rather than carefully constructed lies. 3 months into her assignment at the academy, Sarah received an encrypted message that changed everything. The communication came through channels so secure that she had to drive 2 hours to a safe house just to read it. The message was brief but alarming. Intelligence suggested that a terrorist organization was planning an attack on American soil within the next 30 days. The target was unknown, but the potential casualties were estimated in the thousands. Sarah's superiors wanted her to take lead on the operation to identify and stop the attack. It would mean leaving the academy temporarily on a fabricated emergency leave, assembling a small team of specialists, and going back into the shadows she had just started to emerge from. She spent the drive back to the academy weighing her options. Part of her wanted to decline the mission and recommend another operative. She was enjoying her teaching position and had started to feel like she was building something meaningful with her cadets. But she also knew that her unique skill set and experience might be the difference between stopping the attack and watching innocent people die. That evening, she stood in front of her apartment window, looking out at the academy grounds. Cadets were moving between buildings, heading to study groups or recreational activities. Their laughter carried on the evening air, a sound that had become comforting over the past few months. Tomorrow, she would have to give her superiors an answer. Sarah made her decision based on the same principle that had guided her entire career. Duty to country came first, personal happiness second. She would take the mission, stop the attack, and hope that her position at the academy would still be available when she returned. She had no way of knowing that this decision would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy her career, expose her deepest secrets, and force her to choose between everything she had worked for and everything she believed in. The mission that was supposed to last 30 days would stretch into months, and when she finally returned to the academy, it would be as a prisoner rather than an instructor. The terrorist threat was real, but so was a conspiracy within her own organization that would frame her for treason and leave her standing before 205 cadets as they watch her career and reputation get destroyed. Sarah's greatest mission was about to become her greatest nightmare, and the cadets she had grown to care about would witness her fall from grace without understanding that they were watching the persecution of a true American hero. The emergency leave request was approved without question, as Sarah had known it would be. Her cover story was simple and believable. a family medical emergency requiring her immediate departure. Academy Commandant General Harrison expressed his regrets and assured her that her position would be waiting when she returned. Sarah thanked him, knowing that she might never see the Academy again if this mission went wrong. Within 12 hours, Colonel Sarah Chun had vanished from the Academy and Ghost 7 had been reactivated. She drove to a nondescript office building in Virginia, where she was briefed on an operation that would test every skill she had developed over 15 years of covert service. The terrorist organization called itself the New Dawn Coalition, and their planned attack was more sophisticated than anything intelligence agencies had seen before. Rather than targeting a single location with explosives, they intended to simultaneously strike multiple targets across 3 major cities using a combination of cyber warfare, chemical weapons, and coordinated bombings. The death toll could exceed 10,000 people. Sarah's mission was to infiltrate the organization, identify the specific targets and timing, and coordinate with local authorities to prevent the attacks. She would be working with a small team of specialists, but as the operation lead, success or failure would ultimately rest on her shoulders. The first challenge was establishing her cover identity. Sarah had played many roles over the years: arms dealer, journalist, pharmaceutical researcher, even a casino hostess in Montenegro. For this mission, she would become Elena Vasquez, a former military contractor with connections to international arms dealers and a reputation for being willing to work with anyone who paid well enough. Creating Elena required weeks of preparation. Sarah had to learn enough Spanish to pass as a native speaker, memorize a detailed backstory going back to childhood, and develop the psychological profile of someone who had become disillusioned with traditional military service. She studied Elena's supposed hometown in Mexico, practiced the mannerisms of someone from that region, and even underwent minor cosmetic alterations to change her appearance. The transformation was more than physical. Sarah had to temporarily bury her own moral compass and adopt Elena's more flexible ethical standards. This was always the hardest part of deep cover work, maintaining enough of her true self to remember who she really was while fully inhabiting a character whose values often contradicted her own. Elena's entry point into the New Dawn Coalition came through Viktor Kozlov, a Russian arms dealer who had been under surveillance for months. Sarah's intelligence suggested that Kozlov was providing weapons for the planned attack, though he likely didn't know the full scope of what he was enabling. Her job was to get close enough to Kozlov to learn about his customers and their plans. The initial contact took place in a high-end nightclub in Miami. Sarah, now fully inhabiting Elena's persona, approached Kozlov with a business proposition. She claimed to have access to military-grade equipment that had gone missing during recent conflicts in the Middle East. Kozlov was interested but cautious, as any experienced criminal would be when approached by someone new. Over several weeks, Sarah carefully built Elena's reputation within Kozlov's organization. She provided intelligence about rival dealers, helped arrange successful transactions with other clients, and demonstrated knowledge that only someone with genuine military connections could possess. Gradually, Kozlov began to trust her enough to include her in more sensitive discussions. The breakthrough came when Kozlov mentioned a client who was looking for very specific types of chemical compounds. The request was unusual, not the kind of thing typically sought by ordinary criminals or even most terrorist groups. Sarah recognized the compounds as components that could be used to create a dispersal system for biological or chemical weapons. She managed to arrange a meeting with this client, who turned out to be a soft-spoken chemistry professor named Dr. Ahmad Naziri. To the outside world, Naziri was a respected academic who taught at a community college in Texas. In reality, he was the chief scientific advisor for the New Dawn Coalition and the architect of their planned attack. Sarah spent hours listening to Naziri describe his vision for what he called the awakening. He believed that American foreign policy had caused suffering around the world and that only a dramatic demonstration of vulnerability would force the country to change course. He spoke about his planned attack with the passion of someone who genuinely believed he was saving lives in the long run, by taking them in the short term. The more Sarah learned about Naziri, the more she understood how dangerous he was. Unlike many terrorists who were driven by anger or revenge, Naziri was motivated by a twisted sense of moral purpose. He had carefully studied previous attacks and learned from their failures. His plan was designed to maximize casualties while minimizing the chances of early detection. Through careful questioning and observation, Sarah began to piece together the details of the attack. The coalition had identified 3 targets: a major sports stadium during a playoff game, a busy transportation hub during rush hour, and a popular shopping center on a weekend. Each location would be hit with a different type of weapon: explosives at the stadium, chemical agents in the transportation hub, and a combination of both at the shopping center. The timeline was tight. Sarah had identified the targets, but still needed to learn the exact timing and the identities of the operational teams. This information was closely guarded by the coalition's leader, a man known only as the Architect, who had remained hidden throughout the planning process. Sarah's breakthrough came when Naziri mentioned that the Architect would be attending a final planning meeting in a warehouse outside Detroit. This would be her chance to identify the mystery leader and gather the remaining operational details. But getting invited to the meeting would require taking enormous risks with her cover. She decided to volunteer Elena's services for the actual attack. This meant convincing the coalition leadership that Elena was committed enough to their cause to participate in mass murder. Sarah had done many difficult things in her career, but pretending to be enthusiastic about killing innocent people tested the limits of her psychological endurance. The meeting in Detroit was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. 23 people gathered in an abandoned warehouse to finalize plans for one of the largest terrorist attacks in American history. Sarah sat among them, taking mental notes while maintaining Elena's facade of cold professionalism. The Architect finally revealed himself as Jonathan Reeves, a former military intelligence officer who had been discharged after a psychological evaluation raised concerns about his stability. Reeves had spent 5 years planning this operation, recruiting carefully and building an organization that operated more like a corporation than a traditional terrorist cell. During the meeting, Sarah learned the exact timing of the attacks. They would happen simultaneously at 2:30 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon, just 4 days away. She also identified the operational teams and their specific responsibilities. Most importantly, she discovered that the attacks were designed to trigger a larger crisis. The coalition had planted evidence that would make it appear that a foreign government was responsible, potentially drawing the United States into a devastating war. Sarah now had all the information needed to stop the attacks, but she faced a new problem. The coalition's security procedures meant she couldn't leave the warehouse without arousing suspicion. She was expected to remain with the group until the operation began. She had 4 days to find a way to communicate with her handlers and coordinate the response without blowing her cover. The solution came from an unexpected source. Marcus Rodriguez, one of her former cadets, had joined the FBI after graduating from the academy. He had been assigned to a counterterrorism task force that was working on the same case from a different angle. Through careful coordination with her handlers, Sarah was able to pass intelligence to Marcus without revealing her own identity. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now depending on one of her students to help save the country, while maintaining a cover that made her appear to be one of the terrorists he was trying to stop. Marcus had no idea that the intelligence he was receiving came from his former instructor, and Sarah couldn't reveal the truth without compromising the operation. As the final day of the operation approached, Sarah prepared for the most challenging phase of her mission. She would have to help coordinate the response that would stop the attacks while appearing to participate in them herself. One mistake could result in thousands of deaths, her own exposure, or both. What Sarah didn't know was that someone within her own organization had been monitoring her communications and preparing to use the information for their own purposes. The conspiracy that would ultimately destroy her career had already been set in motion, and the very success of this mission would provide her enemies with the evidence they needed to frame her for treason. The morning of the planned attacks arrived with an unseasonable warmth that made Sarah's bulletproof vest uncomfortable under Elena's leather jacket. She had spent the previous night reviewing every detail of the coordinated response that would unfold in just a few hours. 3 tactical teams would simultaneously move on the terrorist cells, while bomb disposal experts would secure the weapons and chemical agents. If everything went according to plan, the New Dawn coalition would be neutralized without a single civilian casualty. Sarah's role in the takedown was the most dangerous. She would remain with Jonathan Reeves and his core team until the very last moment, then signal for the assault when they attempted to trigger the attacks. She wore a tracking device disguised as a button on her jacket and carried a concealed communications device that would allow her to coordinate with the tactical teams. The first sign that something was wrong came at 1:45 p.m., 45 minutes before the scheduled attacks. Sarah noticed additional security around the warehouse that hadn't been there the day before. Reeves seemed more agitated than usual, constantly checking his phone and speaking in whispered conversations with his lieutenants. At 2 p.m., Reeves gathered the core team and made an announcement that sent ice through Sarah's veins. "There's been a change of plans," he said, his eyes scanning the room suspiciously. "We have reason to believe there may be a security breach. We're moving the timeline up by 2 hours. The attacks begin now." Sarah's blood turned cold. The tactical teams weren't in position yet. The coordination she had spent weeks arranging was based on the 2:30 p.m. timeline. If the attacks began immediately, thousands of people would die before the response could be organized. She had to make a split-second decision that would define the rest of her life. Following protocol would mean maintaining her cover and hoping the response teams could adapt quickly enough to prevent the attacks. But Sarah knew from experience that even the best-laid plans could fail when timing was critical. Instead of following her training, she followed her conscience. "Wait," Sarah said, stepping forward in the warehouse. "I think we should stick to the original plan." Reeves turned to her with suspicion clearly visible in his eyes. "Why would you care about the timing, Elena? Unless you have somewhere else you need to be." Sarah realized she had made a critical error. Elena Vasquez, the arms dealer persona she had been playing, would have no reason to object to moving up the timeline. A professional criminal would simply adapt to changing circumstances. Her objection had revealed that she had some knowledge of or investment in the original timing. "I'm just thinking tactically," Sarah said, trying to recover. "We've been planning for 2:30. The teams are prepared for that timing. Rushing could create mistakes." But Reeves was no longer listening. He was staring at Sarah with the focused intensity of someone who had just solved a puzzle. "You know, Elena, I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday. You asked very specific questions about our chemical compounds. Questions that seemed unusual for someone in your line of work." Sarah's hand moved instinctively toward the concealed weapon at her side, but she stopped herself. There were 12 armed terrorists in the warehouse, and any sudden movement would likely get her killed before she could signal for backup. "I'm thorough in my business dealings," Sarah said, maintaining Elena's confident facade. "I like to understand what I'm selling." Reeves walked closer, and Sarah could see the moment when all his suspicions crystallized into certainty. "The problem is, Elena, we checked your references more carefully after our meeting. Viktor Kozlov, never heard of you until 3 weeks ago. The military contractor you claim to have worked for has no record of anyone matching your description. And the weapons you supposedly provided samples of, they're not missing from any known inventory." Sarah realized that her cover had been blown, but she also saw an opportunity. If she could keep Reeves talking long enough, the tactical teams might still be able to get into position. Every minute she delayed was a minute the response teams could use to prepare. "You're being paranoid, Jonathan," she said, using his real name deliberately. "Check my business record. I've delivered everything I promised." "Yes, you have," Reeves admitted, "which is what made me suspicious. You're too good at this. Too knowledgeable. Too convenient." He gestured to 2 of his men, who moved to flank Sarah. "I think you're federal law enforcement. FBI, maybe CIA." Sarah laughed. putting as much genuine amusement into the sound as she could manage. "You think I'm a cop?" "Jonathan, I've broken more laws in the past month than most criminals do in a year. If I were law enforcement, half the things I've done would be entrapment." But even as she spoke, Sarah could see that Reeves had made up his mind. He pulled out his phone and began typing rapidly. She recognized the motion. He was sending the final authorization codes for the attacks. Time was up. Sarah activated her emergency beacon and drew her concealed weapon in one fluid motion. "FBI, everyone on the ground." The warehouse erupted into chaos. Gunfire exploded from multiple directions as Reeves's men responded to her revelation. Sarah dove behind a stack of wooden crates, her mind automatically calculating angles of fire and escape routes while she tried to raise the tactical teams on a radio. "This is Ghost 7. The operation is blown. Attacks are starting now. Repeat, attacks beginning immediately." The response came through her earpiece in a calm, professional voice that belonged to Agent David Park, the operation coordinator. "Copy, Ghost 7. Teams are moving to secondary positions. Can you contain the warehouse?" Sarah looked around at the 12 armed terrorists who were now actively trying to kill her and almost laughed at the question. "Negative on containment. I'm outnumbered 12-1 and taking heavy fire." What happened next would later be described in classified reports as one of the most remarkable individual combat actions in modern law enforcement history. Sarah used every skill she had developed over 15 years of covert operations to turn a hopeless situation into a tactical victory. She began by creating confusion among the terrorists. Using voice projection techniques learned during her training, she called out contradictory orders in different accents, making it appear that multiple law enforcement officers had entered the warehouse. While the terrorists tried to determine how many people they were fighting, Sarah moved between cover positions, systematically taking out their capability to coordinate. Her first target was their communications equipment. A well-placed shot destroyed the radio setup they were using to coordinate with the attack teams. Her second target was Reeves himself, not to kill him, but to capture him alive so he could provide information about any backup plans. The firefight lasted 18 minutes. When the tactical teams finally breached the warehouse, they found Sarah standing over 11 unconscious or wounded terrorists with Jonathan Reeves zip-tied to a chair. She had sustained 2 minor gunshot wounds, but was otherwise unharmed. More importantly, her actions had prevented the attacks. The intelligence she gathered in the warehouse allowed the response teams to locate and neutralize all 3 attack cells before any weapons were deployed. The chemical agents were secured, the explosives were disarmed, and 23 members of the New Dawn Coalition were arrested. Sarah's success should have marked the pinnacle of her career. She had prevented one of the largest terrorist attacks in American history through a combination of brilliant undercover work and exceptional combat skills. The operation would save thousands of lives and prevent an international crisis. Instead, it became the beginning of her downfall. Unknown to Sarah, Deputy Director Catherine Morrison of the CIA had been conducting her own investigation into the New Dawn Coalition. Morrison had been tracking the organization for months, hoping to use them to identify larger networks of international terrorists. She saw Sarah's operation as interference that had cost her the chance to roll up a much bigger threat. Morrison also suspected that Sarah had been compromised during the operation and might have inadvertently provided intelligence to enemy organizations. The fact that Sarah's cover had been blown suggested to Morrison that there might be security leaks within the covert operations program. But Morrison's real motivation was personal. She had been passed over for promotion twice in favor of officers who had less experience but more successful operations. Sarah's spectacular success on the New Dawn case would likely earn her commendations and advancement opportunities that Morrison wanted for herself. Within days of the warehouse raid, Morrison began building a case against Sarah. She reviewed Sarah's communications during the operation, looking for any evidence that could be interpreted as suspicious. She interviewed other operatives who had worked with Sarah, asking leading questions about her methods and loyalties. Most damaging, Morrison discovered that Sarah had made unauthorized contact with Marcus Rodriguez during the operation. The fact that Sarah had passed intelligence to her former student violated several protocols about operational security and information compartmentalization. Morrison presented her findings to a closed-door review board, painting Sarah as a rogue operative who had compromised security and endangered ongoing operations. She argued that Sarah's emotional attachment to her teaching position had clouded her judgment and led her to involve unauthorized personnel in classified activities. The review board, which included several officials who owed their careers to Morrison's support, agreed that Sarah's actions warranted investigation. They ordered that she be relieved of duty pending a full security review and potential court-martial proceedings. 3 weeks after preventing the worst terrorist attack in American history, Colonel Sarah Chun received orders to report to Westfield Military Academy for disciplinary action. She was told that she would be publicly stripped of her rank in front of the cadets as an example of accountability and proper military justice. Sarah understood what was happening to her, but she also knew that fighting the charges would require revealing classified information about her covert service. She could prove her innocence, but only by exposing operations that needed to remain secret for national security reasons. As she drove toward the academy where her career would be destroyed in front of 205 cadets, Sarah made peace with her decision to remain silent. She had accepted long ago that serving in the shadows meant that her greatest successes would never be recognized and her sacrifices would never be understood. What she didn't anticipate was that one of those cadets in the audience would refuse to accept what they were seeing and would begin an investigation that would eventually expose the conspiracy against her. Marcus Rodriguez had learned more from his favorite instructor than just military tactics. He had learned to question official narratives and fight for the truth, no matter the cost. The ceremonial hall at Westfield Military Academy had never felt as cold as it did on the morning of January 15th. Despite the building's efficient heating system, an atmosphere of uncomfortable tension seemed to drain the warmth from the air. 205 cadets stood in perfect formation, their pressed uniforms and polished boots reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights overhead. General Harrison stood at the podium with the bearing of a man who had been given orders he neither understood nor agreed with, but would follow nonetheless. To his left, a small group of senior officers sat in uncomfortable silence. To his right, Colonel Sarah Chun stood at attention, her face showing no emotion as she waited for her career to be destroyed in front of the young people she had grown to care about. The charges were read in the formal language that military justice used to make even the most questionable accusations sound authoritative. Sarah was accused of unauthorized disclosure of classified information, violation of operational security protocols, and conduct unbecoming an officer. Each charge carried serious penalties, and together they justified her immediate dismissal from service with loss of all benefits and honors. General Harrison's voice carried across the silent hall as he detailed Sarah's alleged crimes. According to the official record, she had compromised an ongoing intelligence operation by sharing classified information with unauthorized personnel. She had violated direct orders by making contact with civilians during a sensitive mission. Most damning, she had demonstrated a pattern of reckless behavior that endangered national security. The cadets listened with the stunned attention of young people watching their world shift beneath their feet. Colonel Chun had been one of the most respected instructors at the academy. Her classes on military strategy were considered among the best in the curriculum. She had mentored dozens of cadets, including several who stood in formation today. Angela Morrison, now a senior cadet just a month from graduation, felt physically sick as she watched her former instructor's rank being stripped away. Colonel Chun had helped Angela through a crisis of confidence during her sophomore year, providing guidance that had ultimately saved her military career. The idea that this woman was a traitor seemed impossible to accept. Marcus Rodriguez, who had graduated the previous year and was now stationed at Fort Bragg, watched the proceedings via secure video link from his FBI field office. As the only Academy graduate currently working in federal law enforcement, he had been ordered to observe the disciplinary action as a learning experience. Instead, he found himself questioning everything he was seeing. Marcus remembered the colonel's tactical classes and how she had always emphasized the importance of questioning assumptions and looking for hidden patterns. The obvious explanation is often wrong, she had told him repeatedly. A good officer learns to see what others miss and question what others accept. Now, as Marcus watched his former instructor's career being destroyed, he found himself applying those same principles to her case. The charges seemed serious, but they were also remarkably vague. Where were the specific details about what information had been compromised? Who were the unauthorized personnel she had supposedly contacted? What ongoing operation had been damaged? The ceremony reached its climax when General Harrison approached Sarah to remove her colonel's insignia. The physical act of stripping rank was a military tradition designed to emphasize the gravity of the punishment. As the general's hands reached for the silver eagles on Sarah's uniform, every person in the room understood they were witnessing the end of a career. Sarah stood perfectly still as her rank was removed, her eyes focused on a point somewhere above the heads of the assembled cadets. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the reality of it was still painful. These young people had looked up to her, and now they were watching her be branded as a disgrace to the uniform she had served with honor for 20 years. What the audience didn't see was the slight tremor in Sarah's hands or the way she had to consciously control her breathing to prevent an emotional breakdown. She had endured torture during a mission in Afghanistan, survived firefights in 3 different countries, and maintained her cover while surrounded by terrorists planning mass murder. But standing in front of 205 cadets while being publicly humiliated was testing the limits of her psychological endurance. General Harrison completed the removal of Sarah's rank and stepped back. According to the ceremony's protocol, Sarah was now expected to turn and leave the hall in silence. She would be escorted from the academy grounds and would never be permitted to return. Her military career, which had included some of the most significant covert operations in recent history, was officially over. But as Sarah turned to leave, something unexpected happened. Cadet Angela Morrison broke from formation. "Permission to speak, sir." Angela's voice cut through the heavy silence like a sword. General Harrison looked startled. Breaking formation during a formal ceremony was a serious breach of protocol that could result in disciplinary action for the cadet. "Denied, Cadet Morrison. Return to formation immediately." Angela remained where she was, her chin raised defiantly. "Sir, I'm requesting clarification about the charges against Colonel Chun." The tension in the room became almost unbearable. Sarah turned back toward the formation, concerned for Angela, but also proud of the young woman's courage. Other cadets began to shift uncomfortably, uncertain whether they should maintain their positions or support their classmate. "Cadet Morrison, you are in violation of direct orders," General Harrison said sternly. "Report to my office immediately following this ceremony." But Angela's defiance had opened a floodgate. Another voice spoke up from the formation. "Sir, Cadet Johnson also requests clarification." Then, another. "Cadet Williams requests clarification as well, sir." Within moments, more than half of the cadet formation had joined the protest. They weren't just questioning the charges against Colonel Chun. They were demonstrating their faith in an instructor who had earned their respect and loyalty through months of dedicated teaching. General Harrison found himself facing a situation that wasn't covered in any military manual. A formal disciplinary ceremony had turned into a near mutiny by some of the Academy's best cadets. Sarah watched in amazement as young people who barely understood the charges against her chose to risk their own careers to defend her. The disruption was ended by Sarah herself. She stepped forward and addressed the cadets directly, violating the ceremony's protocol, but preventing the situation from escalating further. "Cadets, return to formation immediately," she said in the command voice they all recognized from her classes. "Your protest honors me more than any medal could, but You must not jeopardize your own careers for my sake. The military requires discipline and respect for authority, even when that authority makes decisions we don't understand or agree with. The cadets reluctantly returned to formation, but the damage to the ceremony's authority had been done. What was supposed to be a demonstration of military justice had become a display of loyalty to an officer whose true service record remained classified. Sarah was escorted from a hall by 2 military police officers, as protocol required. But as she walked down the aisle between the formations of cadets, she heard something that would sustain her through the dark months ahead. The sound of 205 young people standing a little straighter, their respect for her undimmed by the official judgment of her superiors. Outside the ceremonial hall, Sarah was processed through the administrative requirements of her dismissal. She surrendered her military identification, her access cards, and her service weapon. Her personal belongings had already been packed and were waiting in her car. Within 2 hours of the ceremony, she would be a civilian for the first time in 20 years. As Sarah signed the final paperwork, General Harrison approached her privately. "Colonel, Sarah, I want you to know that none of this sits right with me. I've read your service record, at least the parts I'm cleared to see, and nothing about these charges makes sense." Sarah looked up at the man who had just overseen her public disgrace. "General, you followed your orders, just as I would have in your position. I don't hold any personal animosity toward you or anyone else who is required to participate in this. Is there anything you can tell me about what really happened?" Harrison asked. "Anything that might help me understand this?" Sarah considered her answer carefully. Even now, even after being stripped of her rank and dismissed from service, she was bound by classification protocols that prevented her from revealing the true nature of her work. "General, sometimes serving our country requires sacrifices that can never be publicly acknowledged. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting consequences that seem unjust. I've made peace with that reality." Harrison nodded, understanding that he would never learn the full truth about Colonel Sarah Chen's service or the real reasons for her dismissal. But he also understood that he had just witnessed the destruction of an officer who had probably served with more distinction than he would ever know. Sarah drove away from Westfield Military Academy as a dishonored former colonel, officially branded as a traitor who had compromised national security. But she was also something else, a decorated covert operative who had prevented one of the worst terrorist attacks in American history, framed by her own organization for political reasons. The story should have ended there, with Sarah disappearing into obscurity while Deputy Director Morrison advanced her career by destroying someone else's. But Marcus Rodriguez's growing suspicions about the case, combined with Angela Morrison's determination to clear her former instructor's name, would soon turn Sarah's disgrace into the opening chapter of an even more dramatic story. The truth about Ghost 7's service and sacrifice would eventually come to light, but not before Sarah faced months of exile, investigation, and the constant threat that her enemies within the intelligence community would try to silence her permanently. Her fall from grace was complete, but her most important mission, the fight to restore her honor and expose the corruption that had destroyed her career, was just beginning. 3 months after Sarah Chen's public disgrace at Westfield Military Academy, 2 separate investigations were quietly beginning to uncover the conspiracy that had destroyed her career. Neither investigator knew about the other's work, and both were taking enormous personal risks to pursue the truth. Marcus Rodriguez had been unable to forget the nagging doubts that plagued him during his former instructor's disciplinary ceremony. As an FBI counterterrorism agent, he had access to databases and resources that most people couldn't reach. What he discovered when he began researching Colonel Chen's case kept him awake at night and made him question everything he thought he knew about military justice. The first anomaly Marcus noticed was in the timing of the charges against Sarah. According to the official record, her violations had occurred during an intelligence operation in late November. But Marcus had been part of the task force that received crucial intelligence about the New Dawn Coalition during exactly that time frame. The information had been so accurate and detailed that it had allowed them to prevent a major terrorist attack. Marcus began to wonder if there was a connection between the successful counterterrorism operation and the charges against his former instructor. He couldn't access the classified details of Sarah's specific assignment, but he could research the broader patterns of activity during that period. Working during his off hours and using only resources available to him through his legitimate FBI access, Marcus began mapping the chronology of events. The New Dawn Coalition had been under surveillance by multiple agencies. The crucial intelligence that broke the case had come from an anonymous source with detailed inside knowledge. The terrorist plot had been disrupted just hours before it was scheduled to begin. The more Marcus learned, the more convinced he became that Sarah Chun had been involved in the operation that saved thousands of lives, not the security breach that supposedly endangered them. But proving this theory would require accessing classified information that was far above his security clearance. Meanwhile, Angela Morrison was conducting her own investigation from her position as a senior cadet at Westfield. She had been formally reprimanded for her protest during Sarah's ceremony, but the incident had also brought her to the attention of other cadets who shared her doubts about their former instructor's guilt. Angela's investigation began with simple questions that grew more complex as she dug deeper. She started by reviewing Colonel Chen's teaching methods and curriculum, looking for any signs of the security-conscious behavior that the charges suggested. What she found was the opposite. Sarah had been extremely careful about classification protocols and had never shared any information that wasn't already available in standard military textbooks. Angela also interviewed cadets who had been in Sarah's classes, asking them to recall specific lessons and discussions. Several cadets remembered that Colonel Chun had seemed to have unusually detailed knowledge of modern combat tactics and international security threats, but this expertise had made her a better instructor, not a security risk. The breakthrough in Angela's investigation came when she discovered that Colonel Chen's emergency leave had coincided exactly with a period when several FBI counterterrorism agents had been deployed to major cities across the country. Angela's father was a federal prosecutor who had mentioned the unusual coordination between agencies during that time. Angela began to piece together a theory that Colonel Chun hadn't been involved in a security breach, but in a successful counterterrorism operation. The timing of her departure, the success of the FBI operations, and the vague nature of the charges against her all supported this hypothesis. But Angela faced the same problem as Marcus. Proving her theory would require access to classified information that she couldn't legally obtain. As a cadet, she had virtually no resources for investigating government operations or challenging official narratives. The two investigations might have remained separate and ultimately unsuccessful if not for a chance encounter at a military conference in Washington. Marcus had been assigned to provide security briefings for military personnel involved in counterterrorism operations. Angela was attending as part of a cadet leadership program. During a break between sessions, Angela approached Marcus after recognizing him from Colonel Chen's classes. She had remembered that he was now working for the FBI and thought he might have insights into her former instructor's case. Agent Rodriguez, I was in Colonel Chen's strategic planning class, Angela said, introducing herself. I've been trying to understand what happened to her. Marcus looked around carefully before responding. That's an interesting coincidence, Cadet Morrison. I've been having some questions about that case myself. They agreed to meet privately that evening to discuss their concerns. In a small coffee shop near the conference hotel, they compared their findings and realized they had been working toward the same conclusion from different angles. Marcus had the law enforcement background and database access needed to track the operational timeline. Angela had the detailed knowledge of Sarah's teaching methods and behavior that contradicted the official charges. Together, they had enough evidence to build a compelling case that Colonel Chun had been framed. But they also realized they were facing an enemy with far more power and resources than either of them possessed. If Sarah had indeed been framed by someone within the intelligence community, then pursuing the truth could destroy both of their careers and potentially put them in physical danger. Marcus and Angela decided to proceed carefully using only legal methods and official channels to gather evidence. They would document everything they found and prepare a comprehensive report that could be presented to appropriate authorities if they gathered enough proof. Over the following weeks, they worked together through encrypted communications and careful coordination. Marcus used his FBI access to track the movement of personnel and resources during the November operations. Angela used her network of Academy contacts to gather more information about Sarah's behavior and activities before her departure. Their investigation received an unexpected boost when Angela discovered that one of her classmates, Cadet Jennifer Walsh, had overheard a phone conversation between two senior officers shortly before Sarah's disciplinary ceremony. According to Jennifer, one officer had expressed doubts about the charges, while the other had insisted that Morrison says the case is solid. The name Morrison was significant because it appeared in several of Marcus's FBI files related to CIA coordination during counterterrorism operations. Deputy Director Catherine Morrison had been involved in several interagency disputes during the November timeframe, and her name was associated with complaints about operational interference and information sharing protocols. Marcus realized that Catherine Morrison might be the key to understanding what had happened to Sarah Chun. Using his FBI database access, he began researching Morrison's career and recent activities. What he found painted a picture of an ambitious intelligence officer who had been frustrated by a series of career setbacks and professional disappointments. Morrison's personnel file showed that she had been passed over for promotion twice in recent years. She had also been involved in several operations that had failed to achieve their objectives, while other officers had been succeeding with similar assignments. The pattern suggested someone who might be willing to sabotage a colleague's career for personal advancement. Angela's investigation revealed additional details about the timing of Sarah's departure from the academy. According to administrative records, Sarah's emergency leave had been approved unusually quickly, suggesting that her assignment was considered high priority. The official explanation of a family medical emergency was contradicted by the fact that no one at the academy had any record of Sarah having close family members. Together, Marcus and Angela began to construct a timeline that told a very different story than the official charges against Sarah Chun. In their version of events, Colonel Chun had been a covert operative who was recalled from her teaching assignment for an urgent counterterrorism mission. She had successfully infiltrated a terrorist organization and prevented a major attack, but her success had threatened Deputy Director Morrison's own operations and career ambitions. Morrison had used her position and influence to frame Sarah for the very protocols that had made the mission successful, turning her greatest achievement into evidence of treason. The charges were deliberately vague because specific details would have revealed the classified nature of Sarah's actual assignment. As their investigation progressed, Marcus and Angela realized they were not just seeking justice for their former instructor. They were uncovering a conspiracy that went to the heart of America's intelligence community. Morrison's willingness to destroy an innocent officer for personal gain suggested a level of corruption that could be endangering other operations and other lives. But they also knew that confronting someone with Morrison's power and connections would require irrefutable evidence and very careful preparation. One mistake could result in their own careers being destroyed or worse. Marcus decided to reach out to his former instructor directly, hoping that Sarah might be willing to provide information that could corroborate their theory. He located her through public records and arranged a meeting at a neutral location where they could speak privately. When Marcus finally sat across from Sarah Chun in a small diner outside Baltimore, he saw a woman who had been profoundly changed by her experiences. She looked older, more cautious, but also somehow more determined than he remembered from the academy. "Colonel, Sarah, I need to ask you about what really happened during your last assignment," Marcus said carefully. Sarah studied her former student for a long moment before responding. "Marcus, there are things I can't tell you, even now. Classification protocols don't disappear just because someone decides to destroy my career." "Understand that," Marcus replied. "But I think you were framed by Deputy Director Catherine Morrison for preventing a terrorist attack, not for compromising security. If that's true, then staying silent isn't protecting national security, it's protecting corruption. Sarah's expression showed that Marcus had struck close to the truth. After a long pause, she made a decision that would change everything. "I can't tell you specifics about classified operations," Sarah said slowly. "But I can tell you that sometimes the greatest enemy of justice isn't foreign terrorists or criminal organizations. Sometimes it's the people within our own system who are willing to sacrifice everything we're supposed to protect for their own personal gain." It was as close to confirmation as Sarah could provide without violating her oath, but it was enough for Marcus to know that his investigation was on the right track. The hunt for truth was about to become a battle for justice, with the reputation of a true American hero hanging in the balance. The final confrontation with Deputy Director Morrison would require everything that Sarah had taught her former students about strategy, courage, and never accepting defeat. The disgraced colonel who had once led Black Ops missions was about to face her most important operation yet, clearing her own name and exposing the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed her life.